Welcome to the Clutch Kitten Gaming Podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone. This is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and today is a good day. We're a week into December, which means there's only a few more weeks until Christmas, and for many of us that means some time off work, which also translates to more time with family and more time to game. This is episode 21, and I'm so glad that you were able to make it because today we have a lot to talk about. Today's news is actually multifaceted because it has to do with both gaming marketplaces and revenue splits. Now, before you skip ahead 2 minutes because revenue splits sound boring, I think you'll be surprised at how much this news could affect each one of us. The first part of the news has to do with Steam. If you're a PC gamer like myself, Steam is probably your main hub for games. It's huge, which makes sense because it's put out by Valve. Recently, they put out an announcement about a change in revenue splits for games on their platform. For a long while now, it's been the standard 70-30 split, where developers only get 70% of the revenue generated on the platform. The other 30% goes towards Steam. Now, if your game sells between $10 and $50 million, the split changes to 75-25, and if your game makes above $50 million, the split is 80-20. Although this technically is a positive move, there has been a lot of critique around this change since indie games get pretty screwed over. It's rare for an indie game developer to make over even $10 million, so this probably won't affect most of them. What this change does do is provide a larger incentive for AAA games to keep their titles on Steam instead of creating their own game launchers. For a while now, publishers have started creating their own launchers so that they don't have to fork over millions of dollars to Steam. Companies like Ubisoft, Blizzard, Epic, and many others have been migrating from Steam, but maybe this change will keep them around. This leads into the second facet of this news. Epic Games, the developer of that game everyone seems to know, Fortnite, has announced that they're going to be creating a storefront on their launcher to compete directly with Steam. To add the icing to the cake, their revenue split will be 88-12. And if any of those developers use Unreal Engine, which is Epic's game engine, the 5% royalty fee that usually gets charged to companies will be waived on sales generated through the Epic store. At the beginning of this segment, I talked about how Steam is huge on PC, but this could most definitely be a game changer. There are millions of eyes on Epic right now, all of these people playing Fortnite, and this is their chance to push back on Valve. From the consumer's point of view, it can be super annoying having games on different platforms, but my hope is that this creates a healthy competition that improves both Steam and Epic, and hopefully benefits developers as well. In my mind, if developers, especially indie devs, are making more money, we'll hopefully get better and better indie titles in return. No matter what happens, it's going to be fascinating to see how things play out. My ultimate hope, though, is that this can be a situation where both consumers and devs benefit, and no one gets screwed over. Speaking of transitions and being screwed over, how would you like to wake up in a mysterious trunk with no idea of how you got there or what was going on? That's one question today's game attempts to answer. Today's game is called Garage Bad Trip. First of all, if you try and do research on this game like I did, you'll get a lot of advice on how to trip acid. Although, when you do sift through enough of those sites, you'll eventually stumble upon one that actually has information about this video game. Garage Bad Trip is a top-down shooter inspired by VHS-era B movies. As someone who grew up in the 90s, I lived in the tail end of this period, but for the most part, I wasn't steeped in the type of movies this game gains inspiration from. It was definitely not inspired by the VHS kids movies that I watched at that time. This is inspired by gritty, bloody action films that dip their toes in the horror genre. Garage Bad Trip was released on July 6th of this year and was developed by Zombie Dynamics. They were actually kind of hard to find information on because I believe Garage is their first game. I also believe they're located in Russia somewhere. I threw the language from their Facebook page into Google Translate and it came up as Russian, so that's my assumption, but if I somehow got that wrong, please don't hold me to it. Garage Bad Trip currently costs $14.99 on Steam and takes around 5.5 hours to beat. As this game can be played on PC and Switch, you're able to use mouse and keyboard as well as gamepad. I personally started out with mouse and keyboard and found that to be much easier than using my Xbox 360 controller, but maybe if I started with the gamepad I would have felt differently. In terms of the control scheme, it was just fine. I do, however, have some complaints in terms of how controlling your character felt. We'll get more into that later. Why the hell is it so dark in here? You smell smoke, gasoline, and taste blood on your lip. You remember things getting a bit crazy last night, but not this crazy. You realize that smoke and gasoline probably aren't a good combination, and you eventually push your way out of what you realize is the trunk of a very smashed up car. The driver is dead, completely crushed by the impact. Where was he taking you? Your head is still foggy, and you work to assess your situation as you limp over to the vending machine nearby. You're already in a pretty shit situation, so you figure breaking the machine to get a candy bar isn't such a bad thing. Garage Bad Trip is set in the 80s gone wrong, and you awaken to a bloody scene in what appears to be the parking garage of a large building. You're an ex-drug dealer named Butch, who probably also had some combat training because this game takes you on a wild ride of confusion and carnage. You talk with different characters along the way who slowly reveal to you the craziness of what's going on. You receive story elements through a variety of means. The first way is through conversations with other characters. Whether you're tripping balls and talking with your dad, or talking on a device with some mysterious woman, you get to have some conversations which flesh out both you as the character and the plotline. The second primary way you receive story elements is through items and notes. You find out very quickly in the game that there's zombies and mutants which have caused havoc on what was once a normal place. Due to that, especially in the first few levels, you don't actually see people around. You're fighting monsters, but all the other people have either fled or died. So all you have to build story on is your own imagination, as well as the notes or items people left behind. This actually lends to the horror aspect of the game. You feel alone in the sense that you're the only human in a zombie-infested place, and when you walk into a room and just see blood and guts all over the floor, it makes you wonder what happened. Obviously, zombie games and movies have been done time and time again, but I think Garage Bad Trip did a nice job in creating a certain feel in the world. One touch that stood out to me was a sequence right before the first boss. You walk into a room with just a TV in the center, and if you decide to watch it instead of smashing it to pieces, you end up viewing a very creepy video which gives you some insight on how some of the mutants came to be. You then walk into the next room and it's covered in blood and guts. And scattered throughout the room, you find badges with names of different scientists and their job titles. Just the fact that I was able to read the badges added to my story anticipation because it helped me put together more of the story and conjure up an idea of what the monster would be in my head. When it came to the actual plot, it was filled with a lot of zombie and drug dealer tropes. It wasn't exactly well written, but it did its job when it came to creating a specific atmosphere for the game. The highlight for me when it came to the narrative was definitely in the details of the game rather than the main plot. When I first saw this game and heard keywords thrown around like 80s, top-down shooter, and bloody, I immediately thought of Hotline Miami. If you haven't played Hotline Miami, first of all, play it, and second of all, it's an incredibly vibrant 80s top-down shooter that's both puzzly in its nature and also incredibly crisp and fast-moving. It's a game where one hit kills both enemies and your own character. As someone who loves Hotline Miami, those vibes got me incredibly excited. I was thinking that Garage Bad Trip was going to be the dark stepbrother of that game, but unfortunately I was proven very wrong. Hotline Miami is to Pulp Fiction as Garage Bad Trip is to some 80s zombie movie that I've never heard of. Beyond the obvious connection of both of these games being bloody and set in the 80s, the similarities don't extend much more. That being said, just because a pixel top-down shooter isn't like Hotline Miami doesn't mean that it has bad gameplay. I just wanted you to have an idea of my initial perspective when I started playing this. So what do you do in the game? It's pretty simple. You shoot, kick, punch, and kill zombies, mutants, soldiers, and crazy monsters. I'll be honest, the first zombie I faced properly screwed me over the first couple times until I understood the mechanics better. You walk into a room and a zombie looks up from his meal of guts and bum rushes you. Starting out, you only have your feet and arms as weapons, and that guy kills you very quickly. Before we jump into the character progression, enemies, and combat, let's first talk about something I enjoyed, the flow and feel of the game. These are two aspects that can't be overlooked because even if you have a great system in place, if a game doesn't feel good and gives you too much or too little of that good thing, it's going to be a bad game. In my opinion, the pacing was very nice. You would kill a bunch of dudes, go to the next room, read a couple small notes or pick up some candy bars to replenish health, and then move on to the next room to shoot a bunch more dudes. Some of the fights are actually quite difficult, and I enjoyed the pacing you're presented with. The game also gave me a lot of suspense throughout my entire playthrough. It was great. You already know that I'm not a fan of horror games or movies, but I do enjoy a suspenseful game every now and then. I don't mind having some mystery around the world and some scary guys running after me, as long as the scaring isn't the primary focus of the game. The way that Garage Bad Trip did a great job of adding suspense was through a cone of vision mechanic. This means that you as the player don't see the entire room when you start walking through a door. Your vision is more realistic in nature, which made rooms scary to enter. You didn't know what might run at you from around the corner or what crazy monster was in the room. In one instance, I was walking through a subway and unlike many top-down shooters, which would have allowed me to see the horde of 5 or 6 zombies on the other side of the door I was about to go through, since there was a door, my vision didn't extend to the next room and I ended up getting cornered by all those nasty guys running out at me. So, we've established that the feel and pacing is good, but how about the enemies? A couple of the bosses and large creatures I faced were pretty creative and interesting to fight, but I have an overall negative feeling towards the enemy NPCs because of one enemy in particular, the damn rats. First of all, you end up finding a lot of rats by breaking open boxes. As someone who's been a gamer for many years, it's been programmed into my head to break as many boxes, pots, and planters as I can because I'm bound to find something good, right? Well, in this game, all I could seem to find were rats that seemed to kill me way too fucking fast. Although the whole box thing is annoying, the actual frustration came with fighting them. Before I explain how annoying this interaction was, it's important to mention that this is a twin-stick shooter, meaning that you can shoot any direction and your attacks are independent of your movement. That seems like a super nice thing, but it was such a pain in the ass when it came to these rats because the rats had such a tiny hitbox. Also, the animation of my kick felt very slow, which created the perfect storm of making these critters a nightmare. You might be thinking to yourself, James, you get a gun in this game, right? That has to make it easier to kill the rats. Well, it becomes easier, but again, the issue of the hitbox is incredibly annoying. I often found myself wasting ammo trying to shoot the damn things, and if they got to me, they did a relatively large amount of damage. I need to be careful though, I don't want to rage about the rats the entire time, I just think that it's an important annoyance to bring up because it hurt my enjoyment of the game. This also brings us to the shooting. You get a bunch of different guns as the game goes on, including a pistol, shotgun, and Uzi, and they all feel pretty decent as they act about how you would expect. The shotgun is good up close, the Uzi shoots quickly but is more of a spray gun, and the pistol is accurate but doesn't have a high rate of fire. For the most part, the shooting and action was fun. You have a dodge roll which can help you move out of the way if something's charging at you, and the enemies are satisfying to kill. They spray blood and make you feel like a badass. My only complaint beyond the whole rant about rats is that even the guns felt a little bit unresponsive at certain points. There was something about the gameplay that just felt a little bit slower than it should have. Maybe I'm just so used to the rapid and snappy gameplay of Hotline Miami, but it is something I noticed and that bothered me from time to time. Now that we've looked at the narrative and story, let's discuss the art and sound design of this game. The art style was very interesting. The entire game had an overlay that made you feel a bit like you were watching a VHS from the 80s. The overlay mimicked those lines you get from a CRT TV, and it added a gritty feel and gave you an idea of what time period you were in. This is another big difference between Hotline Miami and GarageBad Trip. Hotline Miami is incredibly bright and vibrant, which lended to the twisted fantasy of being this brutal hitman who can take out an entire house of thugs. GarageBad Trip, on the other hand, takes a grungy and punk visual style. The tones are pretty muted overall. There's lots of grays and browns with splashes of red from clothes and blood. And the VHS style overlay added even more to the dark tone. The darker tone actually lent well to the suspense of the game, and although I wouldn't call the art beautiful, it definitely fit the game. The pixel art itself was good, but it didn't blow me away. In terms of the sound design, it was also pretty good overall. It wasn't stand out by any means, but there were points in the game, like the portion with the TV in the empty room, where the sound added so much creepiness to the experience. I'm personally a wimp when it comes to the horror, so the audio was probably extra effective on me when it came to the basic things like walking into rooms and having the screaming zombie come at me. Now that we've discussed the main pillars of GarageBad Trip, let's take a moment to summarize the positives and negatives. On the positive side, the detail put into this game has more depth than meets the eye. I think the developers tried to add some ways for you as the player to discover and build the lore from what you found. The game also has a very unique aesthetic with the VHS feel, and the cone of vision mechanic was effective in terms of adding suspense to the top-down shooter. On the negative side, there seemed to be a compounding frustration in my mind when it came to the sluggish combat and ridiculous rat enemies. In my opinion, this game could have been so much better if the combat was tightened up and they had increased the size of the rat's hitbox. Don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to difficult enemies or games. What I am opposed to though is difficulty resulting from poor design. We've made it to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I tell you whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. I know I've been pretty negative on a few aspects of the game, and those aspects were frustrating to me, but I do think that there's a fun game behind those annoyances. The atmosphere was solid, the shooting was fun despite feeling sluggish at times, and if you're wanting to just have a good time shooting creepy monsters in the face and seeing their blood spray everywhere, GarageBad Trip delivers. As such, my verdict is to farm up and wait for a sale. If you see it on sale over Christmas, consider picking it up, but I wouldn't recommend buying it for full price. As always, thank you guys so much for tuning into this week's show. If you've been listening for a while now and enjoy what you hear, consider heading over to iTunes even if that's not where you listen and giving the show a 5-star review. It goes a long way for helping the podcast be seen. Also, I would love to hear your thoughts, comments, or even games you think I should play. You can email me at clutchkittengaming@gmail.com or DM me on Instagram or Facebook at clutchkittengaming. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in game.